Joe gave his wife a hug. I mean, we saw this coming. He was still sharp, but he was old. He shouldn't have been messing around with that stuff. I always told him he was too focused on his work. I know the kids will miss him too. For their sake, he died in his sleep. Cathy nodded her head and let out a big sigh. The worst part is I can't even grieve. There's just too much that has to be done. We have to notify family. I mean, a lot of them will probably end up staying here until the funeral. His house needs to be cleaned and his stuff needs to be itemized. Let Brian take care of that. You think it's okay for him to handle that? Dad did have a lot of work stuff still in his house. He'll be fine. He'll probably want to get it done as fast as possible. I'll give him a call later this afternoon to let him know. And for the other stuff, we'll handle it together. Julie can help too. Thank you, she said, as she embraced her husband. Joe knew his wife was taking the death of her father hard. She was tough. She didn't necessarily show it, but he knew she was hurting. The worst part is he couldn't do anything to help. Sometimes a death is just something someone needs to work out on their own. He would support her, of course, but that pain isn't something easily relieved. After work, he vacuumed the living room, made up the guest rooms for the inevitable arrival of family members, cleaned up the kitchen and put the dishes away, trying to ease the workload of his wife in any way he could. By the time he finished it all, it was late and he was exhausted. His daughter Juliet was most likely asleep by now. Joe made his way to the bedroom and sat on the bed, tired. As he was drifting off to sleep, he could have sworn he heard a distinct tapping on the floor, as if coming from below. But seeing as he was exhausted and their room was on the first floor, he just chalked it up to him hearing things, or maybe the house shifting. One of those things. Joe woke up the next morning with his wife beside him. He realized she was awake, staring at the ceiling. "How is your sister?" "She's good. She's taking it hard, I can tell. But she's putting on a brave face. She'll be over later to help get the house ready." "Was Brian okay with helping clean Dad's house?" "Yeah, he should be there today. I might drop by his apartment later in case there's anything from his house he wants to give us." "Is Juliet awake yet?" "No. I'm a little worried about her. She's under a lot of stress. I mean, even before Dad died, she seemed stressed out. Going to college and all. Losing her grandfather. It isn't doing her any favors." "I'll talk to her," Joe said. "Try to cheer her up a bit." In the meantime, he sat up and gave his wife a kiss. "I gotta go to work. I'll leave early and stop by Brian's." Brian overall seemed to be taking everything fairly well, even though it was apparent to Joe that his son was still deeply affected by the loss of his grandfather. Even if recently Brian hadn't spent much time with his grandfather, when he was a kid, Brian and Juliet were over there time after school. Brian always internalized things, though. He was always somewhat self-reliant growing up, wanting to do things his own way, from a very young age. He had moved out and found his own apartment recently, eager to dive into work, responsibility, and overall adulthood. Very opposite of Juliet. Juliet required more attention, more care, more coaxing, But Juliet felt more. She had a little more empathy and compassion than her older brother. She was more creative. But stress affected her a lot, and there was a lot of stress in her life right now. She was going off to college. Her older brother, who she looks up to, moved away. Her grandfather passed away. And overall, it was just a lot for her. Brian had given him an old music box that they had always intended to give to Juliet. He would give it to her later. Maybe it would help cheer her up a bit. That night, Joe went into his daughter's room to say goodnight and give her the music box. He sat on the corner of the bed and put the music box on the table. Your mother and I know this has been a stressful few weeks for you. Grandpa, college, and even Brian moving out. But you should know that your mother and I, and Brian, love you very much. Grandpa did too. He motioned to the music box. Your brother found this old music box when he was cleaning Grandpa's house. Grandpa had told your mother he wanted you to have it. He wound it, and a soft tune began to play. He gave his daughter a hug goodnight and began to prepare for bed. He lay there. He glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. He heard the soft whoosh of the ceiling fan, the voice of his wife in the other room making arrangements for visiting relatives, a car passing by outside. And then he heard that noise again. That tapping he had heard the night before. It was louder, or at least it sounded like it. And it was deliberate. There was definitely a tapping noise coming from somewhere below his bed. He sat up and turned on the lamp, illuminating the room. He scanned around trying to find anything that could account for the noise, but didn't see anything. He leaned over the side of the bed and glanced down. Nothing. Nothing to explain the tapping. After an uneasy couple of minutes, Cathy entered the room. She saw her husband with a confused look on his face. "What's going on, hon?" He considered mentioning the noise to her, but felt he would sound a bit ridiculous, so he kept it to himself. "Nothing. Just a lot going on. I was able to talk to Juliet for a bit. Gave her your parents' old music box. The one they said they wanted her to have." Cathy thanked him for being so supportive, and after a little while they were both asleep. The next evening was the big family dinner, which encompassed family members they haven't seen in a long time. Needless to say, the evening left both Joe and Cathy exhausted. As she was cleaning up, she motioned to Joe. "Go on, honey. I can tell you're tired. You should get some rest. You've done a lot to help." He happily obliged. He was tired. But then he remembered the tapping. Maybe it was all in his head. Maybe he wouldn't hear it again. But sure enough, after a few minutes of being in the room, he heard that heavy, calculated tapping coming from below him. He was legitimately frightened now, but reasoned there must be an explanation. The basement didn't stretch to the side of the house, so that couldn't be it. It didn't have anything to do with the bed itself, and it definitely wasn't just the house settling, whatever that meant. Unable to come up with a logical explanation, he nervously waited for the tapping to die down before attempting to sleep. The funeral was a few days later, and by then Joe had decided he would mention the tapping to his wife. If anything, in case she ever heard it herself, he would have at least given her a heads up. As the evening was winding down and they were finishing dinner, Joe looked at his wife. "Kath, there's something I gotta tell you. Something that's been going on in the house." Kathy looked at Joe, puzzled. He chuckled nervously. "You know, it's actually going to sound kind of ridiculous, and maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me with everything that's been going on, but for the past few days, I swear I've heard tapping on the floor of our bedroom, coming from below. I'm sure it's just the house settling or something, but I just wanted to give you a heads up in case you heard it." Kathy furrowed her brow like she was thinking. The kitchen was silent for a while. Joe studied his wife's face, trying to determine what she thought of his claim. Finally, she spoke. "Show me." Slightly surprised by her reaction, Joe nodded and led her to the doorway of the bedroom. He glanced at the clock. 11:58. He said, "It usually happens a little after midnight." Kathy began to tear up. Joe, still confused, wrapped his arms around his wife. "Honey, what's—" Kathy sniffed and cleared her throat. "When I was younger, I went through kind of a rebellious phase, like every teenage girl does. I was regularly staying out past curfew. Mom and Dad talked to me about it a few times, but it was clear I was going to keep breaking curfew, despite their scolding and discipline. As I got a little older, they got a little more lenient with it. They would let me stay out later without consequence. But no matter how late I stayed out, Dad would always stay up and wait for me. And no matter how late I came home, he would still be up, making sure I made it home okay. Their room was below mine in the house, so they'd be able to kind of hear when I came in. So when my dad would think he heard me come in, he would knock on the wall and I would hear it upstairs. I'd knock on the wall in my room to let him know I really was home safe. He did this until I was out of my teens. I didn't really appreciate what it meant back then." Joe didn't say anything. He just stood there, holding his wife in his arms. They both stood there silent. And then suddenly, slowly, Kathy made her way across the room to the far wall. She balled up her hand and knocked on the wall, tears welling up in her eyes. From that day forward, Joe and Kathy never heard the knocking again.